very special guest. So I got a question for you guys. How many of you are car guys? Everyone? Okay, good, yeah. I figured this audience is going to be a lot of car guys. Now here's another question. How many of you guys are James Bond fans? Wow, okay, it goes together, So ask yourselves, and I've been a James Bond fan all my life, why are we James Bond fans, especially guys? Why are we James Bond fans? I mean, he always gets the girl, right? Okay, but really let's think about this. He gets to fly airplanes. He gets to be in the military. You know, think about it. He gets to break things and go to exotic places. And he gets to drive cool cars. So, let's think about this. Not many of us, well, over the years, maybe we get cool cars. Maybe we go to exotic places. But there's one guy that at least I've met in this life that's really the closest thing to the real-life James Bond that any one of us could ever meet. Let's go through his accomplishments. He flies airplanes. He's been in the military. But unlike James Bond, he doesn't just drive cool cars, he builds them. So with that, I want to welcome my very special guest, the former vice chairman of General Motors, and probably the coolest car guy and the closest thing to James Bond, Bob Lutz. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, George.
Thanks for coming up. Or actually down. This is the first time we're getting together in my collection, in my studio.
That's true. It's usually in my garage.
Yeah, or your Heritage Center. I mean, this guy's got some really cool cars. So, welcome to the California Republic.
Thank you. The People's Republic of California.
Yes, it is the people. It even says it on the actual flag, doesn't it? So, didn't start in California for you. Actually, didn't start in the U.S. for you, did it?
The what?
Your life didn't start really in...
No, life started in Europe, actually.
In Europe? Yeah. Where in Europe specifically?
I was born in Switzerland, in Zurich. That picture was probably at age 3. So age 3 or 4, I forget. But
we got some others of you.
I was sketching. There I am with my cat. The center picture is me smoking a chocolate cigarette.
Started early.
But I always liked oral gratification. Are those pictures fuzzy or... Are those pictures fuzzy or?
They're a bit fuzzy because they are old.
Yeah, or your optics are poor. And then
we are a museum.
The one with the broken arm was my Protestant confirmation at age 16, where I had broken the arm skiing, and the bottom one with the bicycles was the local bike gang, you know, with the old fat tire American bikes that weighed twice as much as they needed to, and coaster brakes, gear. Yeah, my technique up until about age 5 was to lie down on the sidewalk in front of the toy store and throw a screaming fit. And the more my mother tried to yank me to my feet, the more loudly I screamed and stomped. And the passersby were looking askance at my mother and saying, "Why are you being so cruel to that child?" So finally she'd say, "All right, if you promise to stop that right now, we'll go in and I'll buy you a toy car." I had a huge collection of 1 to 43 scale models. Some of them done by Dinky Toys, was still doing good models at the time. Some obviously by Meccano, you know, the British company, and some by, before the war, the German companies who did superb models of German cars. So I had a huge collection, probably would be very valuable today if it were still intact.
And I think everybody in this room can agree to that.
Yeah.
My mother gave away my Lionel train
Oh,
sets.
yeah, I know.
Yeah.
I did keep that. I've got a fairly complete Lionel train set, which I received as a birthday present when I was age 3.
So really, that's financial planning. You keep those things in your life.
You should,
Yeah,
but
I
nobody
agree.
has enough room for all that stuff.
So if I kept the Lionel train sets, I'd actually have a jet like you today.
Who knows? Yeah.
So it wasn't just toy cars that were the influence. I think there were some other influences from your uncles.
Well, my uncle had one that was quite similar to that. Is that a Delay or a Delage?
That is a Talbot Lago Porto Coupe.
Okay. The Porto Coupe?
Yep.
Yes. His was silver. Yeah, the Porto Coupe is one of the handsomest bodies ever on a Talbot, and it's actually a much nicer body than the teardrop coupe that everybody always takes pictures of. But the Porto designs were really beautiful, and even the rear fenders, the teardrop-shaped rear fenders, weren't just linear. They tapered slightly inward at the back. I mean, all of the surface development on this car was just gorgeous.
Was it unusual at that time for an uncle to have a car like this?
Yeah, because by today's standards, these would be, $300,000 cars.
My uncle had a Buick electric convertible. I thought that was cool.
Yeah, even that would be worth something today.
Today they are.
Yeah.
Actually, I do want one. But your father actually had a Jaguar, and usually your trips home kind of looked like this.
Yep, we had a 3.5-liter Jaguar, and Sunday excursions almost always ended by taking the train back home.
But sadly, you didn't learn much from the uncles and your father about driving, did you?
If that's the picture of my first driving lesson, yes.
Yep.
That was
How far did you get in this picture?
out the driveway, a 180-degree loop at full power in first gear. So it was a high-speed, sort of burning rubber turn.
Yeah.
And when the 180 was complete, we went right into our own stone wall. And luckily, neither my uncle was in his early 20s at the time, and it was his car. It was a 1940 Ford base model coupe, 3 on the floor. And, did considerable damage to the car, and my parents heard the crash and came out, and he had been supposed to drive me to the barber shop in downtown Scarsdale. And it was a very short trip. And what happened was, it started out with me asking him, I understand that one is the gas pedal, and I understand the next one over is the brake, but what's that third one? And my uncle, not being terribly mechanically inclined, said, well, you need it for shifting. And I said, yeah, but why? And he said, I can't explain it. Look, come over here, and I'll go to the other side, and you'll figure it out real quickly. And he said, put your foot down on this, and then he put it into first. And he says, now let your foot up very gently, and we started going out the driveway. And then he said, okay, now put your foot down again. And the foot didn't go down on the clutch, it went down on the throttle. And he tried to grab the wheel and everything. It was a big mess. At any rate, that was age 8, exactly 1940. We bent the car.
So let's fast forward a bit. I think everybody in this room and watching this would agree that you are kind of a picture of success, correct?
Well, hopefully,
Hopefully,
at least not an abject failure.
Okay. You'll get out of this bum career sometime and finally do something well. But tell us, when and where did you graduate from high school? How old were you?
22 in Switzerland.
22.
Yeah, my parents had exhausted almost all private schools trying to get me graduated from high school in Switzerland. It wasn't entirely my fault because coming back to Europe, to the European standard education system, and coming out of the US public school system, which back then was a lot better than what it is today, but still not up to the European standard. Every time we moved back to Switzerland, I'd get put back. Their school year is out of phase with ours. They switch over classes in the spring rather than the fall. So whenever I went back to Switzerland,
And just to interject here,
huh?
you weren't just a Swiss kid, you were a Jersey boy.
Yeah, in the German part. And they'd
Jersey?
say, well, we either put them ahead half a year or back half a year. So they always opted for back half a year because it's, how are you in math? Have you had differential calculus? I said, I don't even know what that is. Okay, well, remedial, back half a year in remedial education in math. How far along are you in descriptive geometry? What's descriptive geometry? Okay, back. Is there anything you're good at? I said, I always was an ace in Latin. And then hand me this book and say, would you translate this text for us, please? I said, well, I'm afraid I got A's in Latin, but we weren't doing anything like that. Okay, back in Latin. Do you have any languages besides English and German? I said, not really. So it was just a matter of doing okay in the U.S. school system and then suddenly being in the Swiss school system, and you couldn't cut it. And then I also had some behavioral problems.
Just a few. So much so your father put you in what kind of school?
The final effort was to put me in a so-called commercial high school in the French part of Switzerland. And the French part of Switzerland it's still Switzerland, and it's still very anal, and it's all still very clean, and it's still very rule-based, but it's a whole lot more relaxed than the German part of Switzerland. And that was an environment I could tolerate.
And you met a very interesting man there.
Yeah, I met one of the most significant people in my life, a teacher. It was a homeroom teacher by the name of André Chevalin. I admired him greatly, very charming, witty, well-versed in everything, history, political science. I mean, this guy just could talk about, a fascinating talker about everything. Great teacher, didn't tolerate poor performance, had a biting sense of humor, used sarcasm as a weapon a lot. Was a field grade officer in the Swiss Army, which is all reserve, so he could do that in addition to his high school stuff. And I always thought, this is the most amazing teacher I've ever met in my life. I mean, you have teachers you like and teachers you like less, but this guy was so exceptional. I thought, I can't believe that this guy is devoting his life to teaching a bunch of German Swiss high school students who are down in the... So, a few years later, he was mayor of the city of Lausanne, which is the second largest city in the French part of Switzerland. Then later he was in Swiss Parliament, and he wound up as president of Switzerland. So
your homeroom teacher was the president of Switzerland.
My original assessment was correct. He was too good to be a high school teacher.
So you had a good assessment of people early on, then? You had a good assessment of people early on.
Yeah.
So family influence. Tell us a little bit about family influence. Family influence.
Family influence?
Family influence, yeah, because you were talking with your dad about, hey, I want to be a car designer.
I see. Yeah. Well,
California.
Okay, that's a good question. Yeah, at various times when I was having academic difficulties, my father would say, well, if you don't pick up your game and start getting decent grades and start showing a little effort in school, you're going to wind up in some sort of manual profession. I said, well, fine. I'll go down to Italy and I'll learn how to bend metal at Pininfarina or Ghia or Vignale or somebody like that. And that would have been fine. I mean, unfortunately, by the time I had gotten senior enough, it would have been the end and the decline of the Italian custom bodybuilders. But every time I had one of these ideas to avoid an academic progression, my father kind of talked me out of it. And at one point, I very much wanted to be a car designer, and I was always sketching cars. And my dad said, well, what do you want to do now? And I said, well, I think I'd like to go to LA Art Center or something, become a car designer. My father looked at the renderings and said, if this is the best you can do, I forecast a life of great hardship. And it was a brutally honest assessment. And he said, look, tell you what, why don't you go get a degree in business administration and then maybe a master's in business administration, and then if you still want to be a car designer, I will fund that for you. And by the time I got out with a master's, I didn't
So-
want to be a designer anymore.
Took you a long time to get out of high school, so it would be fair to say you weren't the best of students.
And
But you
I was when
graduated.
I wanted to be. The problem is I rarely wanted to be.
But what did you graduate Cal Berkeley with? What was your GPA?
My GPA out of UC Berkeley in the master's program was 3.83. It was the highest ever
22.
recorded at the time.
Graduated high school at 22, and then you'd go to 3.83.
Yeah. But one interesting thing, my GPA was so good that they got me aside and said, and then some guy said, we've been studying your academic performance, and I was almost 30 years old, married with 2 kids. And so the guy says, I'd really like to hear how you achieve these grades. And I said, well, it's very simple. I have a system. I don't have time for the outside reading because I've got a job and I fly with the Marine Corps Reserve. So what I do is I take verbatim notes in class, and for the midterms and for the tests, I just memorize my notes. And I try to get every subject up to an A. And when it's up to an A, I kind of do cruise and conserve on that one and get the next one up to an A. I never do the outside reading, just always take verbatim notes. And the guy says, so you manage your grades like a portfolio manager? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, he says, Mr. Lutz, I have to say, that is the most cynical approach to education that I have ever seen. Whatever happened to the pursuit of knowledge? I said, I'm almost 30 years old. I need a job. I don't have time for the pursuit of knowledge. I just need to get out of here with a high GPA. And he says, thank you very much. This has been a most disappointing interview.
But you did something else on the side, kind of gave us a little hint. You were in the Marines.
Yeah, well, I was on active duty before I went to Cal Berkeley.
Yeah.
And then one of the reasons I picked Cal Berkeley was because NAS Alameda was right next door, and that's where the Marine Reserve squadrons were. So I could, after morning classes, I could take the 5-mile drive to NAS Alameda, get in my flight suit, fly for a couple of hours, and make late afternoon classes again.
I don't know about you, but my part-time job in college was at a Honda motorcycle store. He flew planes part-time.
Well, but I had another part-time job. I worked at Walnut Creek Vacuum, and I was
You were a vacuum cleaner salesman?
not door to door, but I sold from the counter.
This is the first time knowing of this.
Well, and I was not terribly well liked by the owner because I like to sell Hoovers because they were easy to sell because it's
Yeah.
a great vacuum cleaner and it was easy to demonstrate. But her margins on Hoovers were not as great as on Sunbeams.
Yeah.
So every now and then I was selling Sunbeams. Hoovers. Every woman that came in for a repair, I said, well, you realize, ma'am, this repair is going to cost you about $14, but I can put you into a new Hoover here for around $80, and it would be 4 equal payments, no interest. You give $20 today, you can take this vacuum cleaner home with you. And like almost every repair that came in, I sold a vacuum cleaner. And Mrs. Hicks got me aside numerous times. She says, Bob, anybody can sell Hoovers. I want you to sell Sunbeams. And I couldn't sell a Sunbeam if my life depended on it. Because I didn't believe in
You
the
didn't believe in
product.
the product, exactly. Totally get that. So it would be fair to say that if your uncles had a Porto coupe and your father drove a Jaguar, came from some means, correct?
Sir?
It would be fair to say that if your uncles had a Talbot Lago Porto
Yeah,
coupe,
yeah.
the equivalent of, say, a $300,000 car today,
Yeah.
that you came from some means, correct?
Yeah.
But when you enlisted to the Marines, you enlisted.
Yeah.
You didn't go at officer level.
Yeah, because I had just gotten out of high school in Switzerland, so I would have had to enroll in some sort of ROTC program. That would have been another 4 years. And I was confident that if I enlisted in the Marine Corps, I could then become a fighter pilot. And the recruiting sergeant in New York said, oh yeah, just sign here for 2 years. And once you get to Parris Island, they'll give you the test. And if your scores are high enough, they'll send you to flight training. I thought, oh, well, this sounds easy enough. And little did I know that out of 1,000 or 2,000 recruits, maybe one gets selected for flight training, and even then at the end of a long process.
Yeah.
So I was enlisted for a full year before I got my orders to flight training. But boot camp was also one of the better experiences in my life.
Tell us about ammonia. Tell us about ammonia.
Oh, yeah, that was, our drill instructors had, first of all, they were very much into cruel and unusual punishment because that was the way they hardened you for combat duty. So one of the things they did, they would find an imaginary flaw in the cleanliness of the squad bay, which was Marine Corps term for the barracks. And they would send everybody outside. And then when we were all outside, they would tip over everybody's locker box and spill the contents all over the place. And then the drill instructor and the assistant DIs would throw Paris Island sand all over everything, all over everybody's belongings. They'd dump all the bunks with the sheets and blankets and everything. And then they'd hose the whole thing down. And then one drill instructor would carry a carton of 12 Clorox bottles, and the senior drill instructor would walk down the squad bay with 2 Clorox bottles and smash them together until the whole place is soaked in sand, water, and Clorox. And then we would be invited in to clean up the whole mess. And all we had was our little issue brushes. And it would take us hours and hours and hours, and we'd finally get it all done. And we'd all be cut and bleeding from the little shards of glass, but which were instantly disinfected through the ammonia. And we'd get done with that, and then we'd think, well, that was an unusual experience, very tough, glad it's over. And they'd send us outside and do it all over again.
Wow.
So, yeah. So that type of thing would no longer be politically correct. They'd probably have a congressional investigation because somebody made a recruit bleed. But I think the tougher the training, the safer somebody's son or daughter is going to be in combat. Okay. And it's one of the reasons that the Marine Corps is such an effective fighting force, because one, it's a good selection, and secondly, it's the toughness and the rigors of the training that make for a person who's going to be able to function in a combat situation.
So after the Marines, or actually when you were reserve and then after university, you were looking at a couple of different career choices. What were those
one was to become an airline pilot, which was the easy way out, because that's what all my friends were doing. But again, my father, it was a quick way to get to $50,000 a year, which back in those days was an awesome salary.
Yeah, all the money in the world.
And that's back when the airlines were paying really well, and as opposed to today, when I think professional pilots are underpaid, by the way. But my dad talked me out of that.
So you had an interview with Ford.
Yeah, I had one with Procter & Gamble first because I was interested in marketing, and went to see him.
You at a packaged goods company?
Well, went to see him in Cincinnati, and the interview went great, and they said, now there's just one little formality that we need. You just have to take this written psychological test. And I know what answers I got wrong. It was stuff on a free Saturday afternoon. I would like to A, play golf with friends from work, B, spend time with my family and children, D, C, something else, and D was go for a ride on my motorcycle. Well, go for a ride on my motorcycle, and then if a birdie is 1 under par and a bogey is 1 over par, what's an eagle? I had no clue. And after I completed the psychological test, they sent me a letter, said, don't call us, we'll call you. Procter & Gamble didn't work. And then I interviewed with Ford. And Ford actually expressed great interest in hiring me. Then I told my dad, he said, oh, by the way, now that you got your MBA, what are you going to do? And I said, I'm going to join Ford. And he said, well, why would you do that? They're number 2. And I said, well, General Motors doesn't interview on the West Coast, which is true. General Motors found that when they recruited people from California, they'd stay in Detroit for a year or 2 and then bounce right back to the West Coast. But Ford was a little bit more confident about hiring people from California. So anyway, my dad said, well, you don't want to go back to California. No, he said, well, why wouldn't you talk to General Motors? I said, they never wanted to talk to me. And my dad said, well, that's not a good reason. And he knew Fred Donner at the time, who was chairman of General Motors. And Fred Donner had been head of GMAC in New York at the same time that my dad had been head of Credit Suisse in New York. So they sort of, had lunch at the same club. And so he called Fred Donner and said, hey, my son's going to join Ford, but I think you ought to take a look at him. And they did, and that's how I got my first job at General Motors, which you could almost say was due to parental influence. What?
Didn't you do a professorship in between that?
Sir?
A professorship? Didn't you do a professorship in between that?
No.
You were looking at working as a teacher.
Well, I know. I was at a Swiss. That was a 1-year assignment in a Swiss business school, and I was what do you call it? Not an associate professor. I was somewhere between. I was an instructor, but not a professor.
So there was a time Bob Lutz the academic.
Oh yeah, I devoted a year to the academic pursuit, and a lot of the professors that, despite my cynical approach to education, a lot of the professors at Cal Berkeley at the time were trying to talk me into getting a PhD and becoming one of them.
So it could have been either Bob Lutz, packaged good Procter & Gamble guy,
doing
or Bob Lutz the
marketing
academic.
baby wipes and stuff. Yeah.
But instead you went to, Cody, this is the first place I met ever Bob. There is audio, sadly. That you worked with over the years.
That was GM at the time. And the car that was on the slide for a while was my 62 Corvair, which, that's Fred Donner over on the left there. The guy.
How old were you here?
Sir?
How old were you here?
Let's see, I'd say about 35 probably. That was.
Still had the buzz cut from the Marines.
Oh yeah, well that was just after I had stopped flying with the reserves.
Okay.
And it was my first assignment in GM Europe, so that was probably 1966, 1967.
Is that a quick ascendancy to start meeting the chairman of the company? Like, you're there 5 years at that point.
Well, he was the guy in the middle was managing director of Automobil AG, and I was assigned to Automobil AG. And Fred Donner was on one of the routine visits to the international operations. And I remember that particular visit, we put on a presentation on current market conditions and kept showing that the middle sedan class, this was Germany, middle sedan class was increasingly being invaded by a company called BMW. And the term BMW came up again and again and again, and finally Fred Donner, who was normally not an irascible man, said, wait, stop. Turn on the lights, please. And we stopped the presentation and turned on the lights, and he got up and sort of turned towards the back of the room and he says, BMW, that's all I'm hearing this morning. And they're kicking our butts in the medium segment. I'd never even heard of that company before. So he obviously heard more about it later on.
Well, paint the picture for us. What was GM like in the late 50s and the 60s at that point?
Well, it was late 60s, I would say. The car guys were pretty much running it. That was Bill Mitchell and before him Harley Earl. I mean, the designers basically drove the company, and they were in cahoots with with a bunch of great engineers. And that's why GM was always first with new styles, first with wraparound windshields, first with supercars, first with fins, first with high horsepower, first with multi-speed automatic transmissions. And it's basically, and first with radical styling, like, and at first with cars like the original Buick Riviera. And it was car guys steering the ship, and sometimes made mistakes, and sometimes wasted a lot of money, and a lot of times cars would get created with no idea who the customer was going to be or what division was going to get it. For instance, the original Buick Riviera was designed to be a Cadillac, and you can see it from the V-shaped grille with the egg crate and everything, and Cadillac division said, we don't want it, it's too small. And Buick said, we'll take it, and that's kind of how product planning was done in those days. And again, sometimes it went wrong, but most of the times it went right. And the finance guys back then were all in New York.
Yeah.
And the car end of the real business was run out of Detroit.
But you were hired to be really a sales guy, and you always end up in the product area.
Well, I was supposed to be, I was always in charge of sales and marketing, but I always spent most of my time with the designers and engineers, and I was sometimes criticized for that and said, you're supposed to be out in the field working with dealers. You're supposed to be wholesaling cars. And I said, I know that, but for me to be successful 2 or 3 years from now, I've got to influence what's going on in design and engineering. And I was always successful in my sales and marketing jobs. I just didn't handle the jobs the traditional way, which is going out and spending weeks at a time going from dealer to dealer, playing golf and getting smashed with them in the evening.
So no eagle putts in Marbella with the dealers.
Yeah, that was the original Opel GT with Bunky Knudsen. That was the original running metal car, and you can see if you look at the concealed headlights on the production car, they were all
changed.
different.
The production car changed.
Yeah, and that's my second wife in there, by the way.
So a little nepotism on the job there?
She was very expensive.
No, we did say James Bond always gets the girl, doesn't he? So things changed, and you got a call from Bill Mitchell before one of your trips back to Detroit, and he said that he needed to see you as soon as you got back to Detroit to show you something real special, right?
Yeah, so I went.
He said that you needed to come visit him.
Yeah.
Because he wanted to show you something that's just going to knock you on your ass.
Yeah. That's the. Well, every time I was on home leave, the person who way in advance said, hey kid, he's called everybody kid. Hey kid, you got to come and see we've got some stuff that'll just knock your socks off. And whenever I came, he'd always give me one of the design collection cars. He said, we've got a Mercedes convertible, we've got a BMW, we've got a Ferrari Dino. I said, I'll take the Ferrari Dino. So the whole time I was in the States, I had a car that was officially assigned to me by the human resources people, plus I had a Ferrari Dino. So he liked me, and he said, and I always got a complete tour of design. So he said, this next one is gonna, the kid, this one's gonna knock your socks off. It's the finest piece of work I've ever done. So in we go, and no.
Now keep on going forward.
No.
There it is.
Yeah, the boat tail riv.
Oh.
With that, that sweep spear. Actually, now in historical
that's
retrospect,
the Silver Arrow. That's the car. That's the show car.
Yeah. And now it doesn't look so bad, but at the time it just, especially the actual model of the production car with that long tapering, sort of 1930s fastback rear end, and I was puzzled by it, and I said, "Gee, Bill, I just don't understand this one." And his reply was, he got mad, and he said, Well, that's okay. If you understood it, I'd be worried. But as it happened, the car was never a great success.
Oh, it was on the market 2 years. It was on the market 2 years.
Yeah.
That was it.
And they didn't sell very many, and it was certainly nowhere near the important design statement that the original Riviera was.
Oh, stunning car. Now so we know you, most people know you as the guy that flies jets, but you had other hobbies that you did.
Oh yeah, that was in Europe. We weren't allowed to race because the racing ban was on in General Motors at the time. So through the marketing budget, we funded a General Motors, that was General Motors France dealer team. And the dealer team was run by Henri Greder and his girlfriend Marie-Claude Beaumont, both, who was also a very fast racer and rally driver. And they competed for us in the Monte Carlo Rally and various others, and I frequently got rides. This was in a Group 5 Steinmetz Opel with a 24, no, it was a dual overhead cam conversion off of the Opel 6-cylinder engine. That bike, back in those days, it had about 200 horsepower, which was considered pretty awesome. That was at the Hockenheim ring. So I'd get rides. That's in a Zach Speed Turbo.
It's a hell of a line, Bob.
That's in a Zach Speed Escort.
That's a hell of a line you got there.
Well, you know, everybody cheated.
I mean, that's...
Everybody cheated a little bit.
So basically, you're still having some troubles for the 100-yard drive?
I was okay. I have a German racing license, an SCCA license, a Calc. I always, did 1 or 2 races a year, so you never get, at that pace, you never get really good.
So speaking of Germany, you decided to go and see that company that your former boss never heard of.
Exactly, BMW, yeah. That was an interesting time.
Why was it interesting?
Well, we had, first of all, it was a period of rapid growth, and the CEO to whom I reported was a somewhat strange, kind of Machiavellian guy.
How old were you at the time?
I was, let's see, 70. I was exactly 40.
Okay,
and he was about 42,
and
44.
For the record here, give an idea of how many cars BMW was selling at the time.
Oh yeah, they had 180,000 cars and 20,000 bikes. So
Toyota sells more Camrys in 1 year than that.
Yeah, that's reminds me of another favorite statistic, which is GM in 1 hour builds more cars than Tesla has done since its inception.
So back to the 60s or late 60s, early 70s, you're working for Herr Quandt.
Early 70s. And it was an interesting company because it kind of had a car guy culture, but not among the senior management. I thought if I'd left General Motors and went to BMW, we'd go to lunch and all we'd ever talk about is cars, 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 and what are we going to do? And it turned out that nobody wanted to talk about cars, and that was sort of left to the lower levels to sort out. Luckily, the lower levels knew exactly what to do. And, whether it was, design was all outsourced to Bertone at the time. So
who's this guy?
That gentleman is Herbert Quandt, who is he was
he's the patriarch.
The family father of the Quandt family, which owned the Quandt Group, Mauser Small Arms, Big Golden Chemistry, et cetera, and he had bought all of BMW for about $100 million when it was near bankruptcy.
In 59.
And he then put in another $400 million and created the BMW 1800 and 2000 sedans, and then the 3 Series. He was blind.
So you had an interesting job at auto shows, didn't you?
Yeah, see, notice me leading him around. And he would actually feel cars, and he would make very, very astute design comments based on feel. And when we wanted to do on the 320, the first 320, we wanted to do that those kidneys, with the kidneys which slightly protruded from the grill. Yeah, you see that those character lines on the hood continue forward, and the grill stood proud.
Yeah.
And I told him about that, and I said, that's what I'd like the car to have. And he said, well, I'm not sure. And so we actually, he didn't live in Munich, he lived up in Bad Homburg near Frankfurt. We did that front end in clay, and we cast it in plaster of Paris. And we put it in a Samsonite suitcase and sent it to him in Bad Homburg, and he snapped open the Samsonite suitcase and felt it and liked it. So
really?
That was the owner's approval of what is now the standard BMW front end.
New definition of I feel you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's step back a little bit. This is here for a reason. When we're designing cars today, when we're doing the shapes, what do car manufacturers generally use to get these shapes before they put it in metal?
Before they do a clay, you mean?
Well, the clay. I guess give it away. They do it in clay.
Well, no, they do it on the computer first.
Well, today they do it in clay, but back in the day when you were at General Motors, how did they do it? They did the sketches, then they went to this.
Oh yeah, you did sketches, and then you did these 1/8 scale models, or 1/4. Sometimes they're 1/4. This looks like it's an 1/8.
This is a quarter.
Yeah, okay.
And this, back in GM, they did the clay back then, right?
Oh sure, yeah, everything was clay.
So you get to BMW, and they say, go and see the new 3 Series.
I know where you're going, yeah. Because this was the new 320, the first 3 Series, was going to be the first car that was done in-house and not done by Bertone. And when I got to BMW, my direct reports in marketing all said, Mr. Lutz, first thing you got to do is go look at the replacement for the 2002, because it's a disaster. We'd rather keep the current one. And I said, really? They said, yeah, you got to go look at it. So I went to look at it, and I got cleared into this secret room. And design was a division of body engineering at the time, so it was totally run by engineers. And here was this horrible rectangular slab-sided. It looked like a tipped-over refrigerator, and it was really, really, really bad. And I talked to the designer, who was really a body engineer. I said, this won't do. And he said, well, why? And I said, well, first of all, you got to introduce a little tumble home. You know, we need to wrap the glass towards the inside a little bit. Then it needs a little plan view. And the deck lid is way too short. And he looked at me and he said, well, we can't change that anymore. I said, why? I said, you just have to change the model. And he said, no, we can't change the model. I said, why? He says, it's all done in hardwood. Oh. It's all done in hardwood, sanded, filled, sanded, filled, sanded, filled, and then painted, and they had real glass in it. Oh. And the moldings were done in brass section, chrome plated, attached to this thing with tiny little nails. And he said, it'll take us months to change this model. I said, well, that's not acceptable. But he didn't report to me. He reported to my colleague in engineering, who was an ex-Ford guy. So we talked it over, and I went to see von Kuhnheim, and I explained to him how modern automobile manufacturers do clays, because clay can be easily changed, and you can look at various alternatives for low cost. And von Kuhnheim said, sounds good, let's get going. And then we got the base plates and everything that you need to do clay models in a design studio.
But where did you get all this stuff?
Huh?
Where did you get all this clay and the
Well,
plates?
that's the whole point. Then we went to buy clay.
Yeah.
And there's no modeling clay available because the future supplies have all been bought up by General Motors and Ford. So I called Dave Holtz, who at the time was chief designer at Opel, and I said, Dave, they got a problem here at BMW. I talked him into doing clay models, but we can't get any clay. I said, that's not a problem. We'll divert a shipment or two. We don't need it. We just reserve it in advance to make sure that we have it when we need it, but we don't really need it. We'll ship a batch down to you, and we'll send you some clay modelers, and we'll show you how to do the armatures, the wooden armatures, because these aren't solid clay. If they were solid clay, they'd break in the middle. So what you do is you do like a wooden chassis.
It's like a wooden buck.
So only the outer layer is really clay. The inside is like a little wooden house. So they showed the BMW guys how to do that and how to trowel the clay on, and there was about and this is one of these little known facts about General Motors informally rendering assistance to tiny little BMW, not considered a threat. They're a little specialist manufacturer. Why worry about them? And Dave Holt said, I said, well, are we going to pay you? He said, well, you pay the clay company for the clay. And I said, yeah, but what about GM and all the assistance you're giving us? He says, I only want one thing in return. I said, what's that, Dave? He says, when you do the first clay model of the motorcycle, I want to see how you do the spokes.
So BMW decided to come over to the US, and obviously they have their own ways of doing things, but you're the sales and marketing guy. How effective do you think it would be to sell German sports sedans, even early on in life, if they were sold under the guise aus Freude am Fahren?
What, BMW's early foray in the States?
Yeah.
And
like in Germany, aus Freude am Fahren. What does that mean?
Freude am Fahren, that means for the pleasure of driving.
Yeah.
And that translated into the US of the ultimate driving machine, which I thought was a really good slogan. But BMW in the 70s was in the grips of one Maxie Hoffman of Hoffman Motors.
New York, Park Avenue.
He was
in New York, Park Avenue.
Yeah, exactly.
The old Mercedes showroom.
And he had every single European franchise that you could ever name. He'd had Jaguar, and everybody wanted to get rid of him. After a year or two of Maxie Hoffman, they all got rid of the contract, and he always said, he would say to me when I said, Maxie, we can't live with you as importer distributor for the United States. You're not good for our business. He said, Bob, let me tell you something. I may not be a good importer distributor, but I'm very good when it comes to writing contracts. I want you to remember that. And he had like $100 a car for life for every Jaguar, $200 a car for life for every Porsche, et cetera, et cetera. And the one mistake that he made in his life that he regretted forever was he was the original importer and distributor for Volkswagen.
Wow.
And he couldn't sell any. So he'd sold about 200 cars and he turned the franchise back in. And of course, for nothing. That was the first time he ever turned a franchise in for nothing. And of course, Maxie Hoffman was very much Austrian Jewish who had left Europe on time. And Mercedes was going to sue him to get the franchise back. And Mercedes sent their head of sales and marketing, whose name, unfortunately, was von Brauchitsch. Same name as one of the celebrated Nazis. And,
horrible.
And he said, Mr. Hoffman, we are going to take this away from you because you are in violation of everything. You are not doing Mercedes any good. And we are going to sue you to get the franchise back. And Maxie said, yes, well, one thing you got to know about New York, many of the judges are Jewish, and I am Jewish, and how do you think you're going to do with a name like von Brauchitsch? We ultimately got rid of him, but it was tough.
It was tough, okay.
We always went to good restaurants when we discussed his franchise, and one day he said to me,
I'm from New York, we eat well in here. Come on, man.
He said, well, he tried to bribe me once. He wanted to know how much I made, and I told him it's none of your business. And he said, well, whatever it is, you deserve much more. And I said, well, what do you mean? He says, well, if you would be my partner instead of my adversary, I can easily set up a Swiss bank account, and part of the profit from importing BMWs, I would move that over to you. Nobody would ever know about it. Be in a secret Swiss bank account. I'd say, Mr. Hoffman, you're trying to bribe me. He says, no, I'm only because you're a good boy. I like you. I want to make you successful. I said, but Maxie, it's illegal. I said, well, I don't think so. If it's between friends. He was a character. People who knew him vaguely loved him. People who knew him well did not.
Wow, kind of like Carol Shelley, huh? Yeah. So you had other hobbies. I think we got to scroll through here a little bit. So we know about this hobby.
Yeah, that was my first L-39, which I later donated to the Yankee Air Museum. And
it's out here, yeah.
No, it's in Willow Run.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So we got an air museum called
That's
Yanks
probably
Air Museum
the
out here.
Heritage, or it used to be the Confederate Air Museum, which is probably something else.
Something like that, yeah.
I don't know.
But I think you got some other interesting hobbies here.
Oh, that's skeleton riding in Switzerland. These are like almost 100-pound sleds with lead weights under the belly pad, and you go down an icy channel, much like a bobsled run, but narrower, and with banked curves. And the banking is such that you've got shoes with ice spikes on them. And when you go into a corner, even if it's got like a 90 or 120 degree banking, you've got to drag 1 foot and get the sled into a sort of a power slide to where it's pointing to the inside of the corner, otherwise you go out the top. In other words, the top speed of these things is higher than what the banking will take.
What is the top speed of these things?
You reach speeds of close to 100 miles an hour.
Are you serious on that little thing?
Well, they're weighted with lead. And
do they still do this today? They just still do this today?
Oh yeah, there's called the St. Moritz Tobogganing Club.
This is awesome.
And the Royal Air Force used to use that as part of pilot training. All of the Royal Air Force cadets would go over to St. Moritz, Switzerland, and they would kind of start training them for fighter pilot skills on these so-called skeletons.
Wow, snowboarding.
It was an Olympic discipline for a while, and it's a little bit like luge, except in luge you're sitting upright. Here you're prone with your chin about 2 inches off the ice, and the sensation of speed as you're going down that channel, it's like that. It's like in George Lucas's Star Wars, where they go down through this channel of buildings. It's like that. It's an incredible sensation of speed. It feels like it's about 5 times faster than what it actually is.
So this is the Swiss definition of bobsledding?
No, the bobsledding exists. In fact, the
guys,
two tracks.
That works at a comedy store.
In fact, the two tracks. It was the English invented this.
Okay.
It was a part of UK craziness.
Another thing most people don't know about you is you're a bit of a family man.
That's my youngest daughter, who lives in Chicago with one of our kitties.
The cats are a big theme with you, I've noticed.
Sir?
The cats are a big theme with you.
Yeah,
there's a picture of you as a baby with a cat. Here's
I like
this, and then what was it? 2 weeks ago I came to visit you, Bob. I was at Bob's house, and Bob has this stunning Bengal tiger cat. I mean, this thing is gorgeous. It ripped apart his book.
That's true.
From Bob's cat.
We're at my daughter's house in Palos Verdes, and she is presenting us with a second one, who will be going back to Michigan to chew up even more books.
Okay, well, I'll take one. I like tigers.
Yeah.
Thanks. So I got a question for the audience. How many of you have gone to Paris? Show of hands. You flew to Paris? What's the name of the airport there? Charles de Gaulle. Bob actually hung out with the man himself.
That's President Charles de Gaulle.
Yeah.
At the Paris Auto Show.
And then you got another one with him.
Yes. Actually, he talked to me for quite a while because he saw my haircut.
Yeah.
And asked if I had been in the military, and I said yes, the Marine Corps. And he commented, yes, the U.S. Marines, we respect them very highly. And then he talked about some of the elite French units that he had commanded, and And on the stand, that's Ralph Mason again, off on the right, one of the subjects of my book. And then the GM concept car that year was the 4-rotor mid-engine Corvette.
Aerovet,
remember?
yeah.
And we had a girl on the stand in a very tight silver, a skin-tight silver jumpsuit. And the general kind of surprised me by commenting on the shapeliness of the lady. And so then we started talking about females and their forms for a while, and then his handlers quickly took him away.
Welcome to France. But that's not the only place you went. Where's that?
That's number 10 Downing Street.
And then
that's a Ford visit.
It's a Ford visit to number 10.
Yeah.
And then that's not the only place you were hanging out. Where's this?
That's King Juan Carlos of Spain. There was a great guy, supercar guy. The guy on my right, on the left of the picture, is Red Poling, former CEO of Ford, and to his right is Phil Caldwell. Juan Carlos is quite a guy. I think he's getting older now, but he always, for some reason, he liked Fords, and he liked the European Granada station wagon. Nothing to do with the U.S. Granada. It had the European one had had suspension and 4-wheel disc brakes. It was a really nice car, and he always wanted the V6 with turbocharging. And we always was not in the product portfolio, but we always made one for him, and I always got to deliver it, which was
so. If you're a king, you get a turbocharger on your car? If you're a king, you get a turbocharger on your car?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, he loved to drive. He'd drive himself. He was also a big BMW motorcycle guy.
But at that time, you had gone to Ford. Why did you go to Ford?
Why did I go to Ford?
Yeah.
Well, after about 3 years at BMW and getting really, really tired of my boss, I got a call from actually General Motors and Ford almost simultaneously. General Motors would have wanted me back. Ford wanted me to be head of Ford of Germany. And it was Pete Estes at GM who called me and says, "Oh, Bob, Jesus, don't go to Ford. Don't go to Ford. I can fix this. Don't worry. Just give me a couple of weeks. Stall them off. I can get you a really, really meaningful job at General Motors." Well, he just couldn't. And I finally went with Ford. And that picture was taken in front of the Ford headquarters in Cologne, Ford of Germany headquarters.
It's a picture you don't see very often of you in front of a blue oval. But an interesting thing happened so here's Henry Ford II, is that it?
That was at the Monte Carlo Grand Prix, and the kid with the long hair to my right is Edsel Ford.
Edsel Ford.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting times at this point. So let's go to the next car here. So that was the Granada you were talking about?
That picture was taken in Greece, and it was
Greece.
Turkey.
Turkey.
It was Turkey. That was what had been the Ford Taunus in Germany, and when we stopped building it, it started building the Ford Sierra with an entirely different body. We were able to do a joint venture with a Turkish company, and they actually built, this was the first all-metal car ever built in Turkey.
Really?
Up to that point, they had always had this locally made car, a four-door sedan made entirely out of fiberglass, ugly as sin. But this became their first domestic hard-tooled car.
Now the country is full of Fiat. It's all Fiat.
Totally automotive. Yeah. In fact, all of the Ford Transit Connects in the States all come in from
yes,
Turkey.
They are. Yeah. This is an interesting time for you. The world, GM, everybody was switching to front drive, but that car wasn't.
Yeah, it's because our capital budget at the time didn't allow the transition to east-west engines or east-west transmissions. So we had to stay with the longitudinal format. It saved us about close to $500 million. And my argument with the marketing guys was, no, we need front-wheel drive. I said, show me a front-wheel drive Mercedes or BMW, and they couldn't. And I said, why don't we, instead of going with what the mass producers do and follow the trend to front-wheel drive, why don't we do what the prestige producers do and do a really good, low-cost but premium architecture with fully independent rear suspension, four-wheel disc brakes, and everything. And their argument was, yeah, but you won't get the equivalent fuel economy. And I said, well, we will if we get the drag coefficient on the car right, which explains the very aerodynamic styling. And the car was actually excellent. It had great fuel economy, great ride and handling, a lot of room, and we never had, and then we later on did an all-wheel drive version.
Oh, this was a championship rally car. Well, these turned into the Sierra Cosworth RS.
Oh yeah, the Sierra Cosworth 275 horsepower, which back in those days was an awesome number.
Santa Maria Madre, they were awesome. But at the time, the industry was changing. So you had, you were still over in Europe at the time, but in the US, you had Cathay come in.
Yeah.
You had Japanese imports from already making small cars, but GM, Ford, and Chrysler were making big cars. What happened to get from there to, say, the mid-'80s?
Well, incredible amounts of spending for downsizing, and everybody had to meet a timetable, and every American company had to junk all of its large rear-wheel drive platforms, big V8 engines. GM got out of the V8 business almost entirely, and GM went all front-wheel drive. At one point, there was even discussion of making the Corvette front-wheel drive.
Oh.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. Thank God.
But it was an engineering task. First of all, it consumed tens of billions of dollars of investment. But when you have to completely keel haul your whole product line at once, it was just more than any engineering group in the world could handle. So the resulting cars were technically sophisticated, but the quality and reliability were just terrible. And that's when Detroit collectively lost its reputation for quality.
And these are great examples. These are the X cars.
CAFE requirements nearly destroyed us.
These are the X cars, the GM X cars.
Oh,
the
they were
Citation.
awful. Oh, they were awful. Yeah, from a quality and reliability standpoint, they were just terrible. And it was just because we didn't have enough time, and the government was intransigent. And the Japanese, who were doing only small cars, they were on the good side of the CAFE equation.
Yeah.
So they would go to Washington and say, oh, please do not make an exception for Detroit. They should do what we have done over the years, which is build fuel-efficient cars. So do not allow them extra time. They should be able to do it. Well, the Japanese had never in their lives built cars as big as the American cars, but the average senator or congressman didn't know that. And I would say the original CAFE regulations with the corporate average fuel economy might as well have been written by the Japanese car companies. And they almost did the American industry in. And now the reason that everybody kind of is in favor of today's CAFE and the Japanese don't like it very much is because this time, no matter what category you're in, you need a certain improvement factor. So there's no free ride for the Japanese anymore. First CAFE was a free ride for the Japanese and a terrible, terrible burden for the domestic industry.
So this was a huge switch from when you first got into the business, when GM basically was the king.
Yeah.
Everything was different.
Yeah.
And you started collecting cars, and you have an example of interesting engineering, but not from that time. Let's go and take a look at your collection.
Well, we've got the Riley MPH, which has a very interesting...
And this is in England?
Yeah, this was when I was chairman of Ford of Europe. The MGTC, everybody recognizes. The 1938 MGSA, a 2.3-liter six-cylinder sedan. Another interesting car which had a feature was probably more important back then than now, which was a hydraulic jacking system where you could jack the whole car up.
Wow.
And rotate tires. That's my second wife again, I think, in front of the
I got
house.
these pictures from Bob, by the way. Yeah. And now this
that's
one's
that's my big Citroen 6.
Which you still have.
I still have it. That's one of the most ahead of its time cars ever. This one is a 52 model, but it's aesthetically identical to the 1934 car when it was introduced. It was the world's first mass-produced unitized body, world's first four-wheel independent suspension by torsion bars. Front suspension was by longitudinal torsion bars, each ending in A-arms, like the Chrysler system in the mid-60s. The rear was transverse torsion bars with trailing links. And the ride and handling of that car, I'd place it on the same level as the best of the modern cars. Had, from inception, Michelin X radial tires because Citroën was owned by Michelin. So
And when was this car originally produced?
that one you're looking at is a 52 model. But the car never changed from 1934.
So 1934, some of the stuff you just described wasn't even working in the 1980 Chevrolet Citation.
Oh, absolutely. That's why I say compared to what the US was producing,
Yeah.
this thing was like 40 years ahead of its time.
So we're near Hollywood here. We're actually not far from the old MGM studios. What is a line that one of that company's bosses came up with that would define this?
Well, there's nothing wrong with Hollywood that good movies wouldn't fix.
Exactly.
And it's the same in the car business. There's
Pretty much any business.
nothing wrong with any car company that great products won't fix.
Some more racing, right? There you are.
Yeah,
trying to
that's,
get yourself into a
these are
Zaxby's.
Zaxby's Turbo Capris, which was a ground effects car. Yeah, there it is at the Hockenheim ring again. That was 700 horsepower out of 1.6 liters. With,
So an executive from Ford is driving a 700 horsepower race car.
Yeah, and my lap times were actually very close to those of the pros.
I don't think Mark Fields does that.
Well, I don't know. I've never driven with him, but I have no
700
reason to believe that he
horsepower.
isn't a good driver. But no, I was one of my ambitions was to become a race driver, and I was never quite good enough for that.
Do we have audio for this video here? So, Bob, you and I raced once. Shall we
did.
show people what we raced?
Oh, yeah.
Get around.
Hey, let me show you. Come on. And this is how we get around.
This is totally cool. We got to try these things.
You know how to ride one?
I live in California with more of these than cars.
Okay.
Okay, Bob, it's a race to Priscilla.
All right.
Bob, when I first met you at the Heritage Center, I had no idea I'd be racing you on a Segway a year later. Hi, Priscilla. Bob, I have to say. The finish line was the Swan, the Black Swan.
Yeah.
You won.
Yeah, I would hope so.
So the interesting thing about, other than us racing on Segways, that car in the film, so there's one car that has a tie to your father.
Yeah, when I was 2 years old, my earliest recollection of a car was a Diana Cream, which is the name of that yellow. It's much more yellow on this slide than it is in real life. It's more of a custard cream color. My parents had a 34 LaSalle that was exactly like that. And this is not my parents', but it's identical.
And we got one here, kind of just like it, the Argentine version. Granted, not the color that you like. Bob was very vocal about the color.
Yeah, and that one's right-hand drive.
Yeah. And then there's an interesting story with this car.
That's my dad's Aston Martin, which I still own, which was
Like
in the
it,
earlier,
or
which
is
was
the
in
car?
the video
Yeah.
when you talked about racing the Segways.
So this is your dad
That's
with
my
the car.
Dad. My dad that's the actual car. Yeah, that's my dad, and
then here's the car
he was
today.
in his 40s. That's after I found the car in Switzerland and had it restored, and that's my dad, supposedly in the same pose, but he was in his late 80s at that point.
Did the car stay in the family?
No, it had been gone for about 30 years. I found it by accident.
So you didn't even know where it went?
I had no idea.
Wow.
My dad wanted to sell it to me when he traded up to a 59 DB2 Mark III-S, which was, the engine had gone from 2.6 liters to 3 liters, and it had 3 dual throat horizontal Webers on it, and it developed 205 horsepower. So for the first time, a DB series, DB2 and 3 series had enough power. So he went for the brand new 59 one, and as is always the case with these exotic supercars, the resale value is terrible because the people who can afford them want a new one. So he wanted to give it to me for 1,000 Swiss francs, which at the time was $250.
For that car?
Yeah, but I was in the Marine Corps, and I just couldn't deal with another car. What was I going to do with it? So I turned it down, and he wound up giving it to his chauffeur at the bank. And when I found it in a very derelict condition, it cost me $80,000 just to buy it in the condition it was in prior to restoration.
250 or 80,000.
Yeah, that's why we should all keep stuff.
Yeah, it's a couple Lionel train sets there. Then you decided to go work for Chrysler. Actually, there's your dad again. Let's go up to the Chrysler. So what was going on at Chrysler at the time?
That was the Dodge Portofino. And that was when shortly after I got to Chrysler, we were kind of stuck in a rut. If you remember the K cars and the Dodge Dynasty, Chrysler New Yorkers, Fifth Avenues, all very angular, very old-fashioned with vinyl roofs and opera windows and so forth. And at the Pacifica studio, there was basically that car. And I saw it off in a corner, and I asked Tom Gale, Pacifica studios are down in
Carlsbad.
Carlsbad, exactly. Yep. I said to Tom Gale, I said, wow, what's that? And he said, oh, that was something we were screwing around with about 18 months ago. We called it the Navajo, but it never went anywhere. And I said, well, wait a minute, we just bought, what was it? He said, well, it was going to be a mid-engine sedan. I said, but Tom, listen, we just bought Lamborghini, and we could take the 6-cylinder Yalpa engine. The V8 probably wouldn't fit, but the 6-cylinder Yalpa with the transaxle, we could probably create a really exciting show car out of that. And we did, and that became the Dodge Portofino, that got international attention. I mean, we showed it first, I think, in Frankfurt, and it got everybody realizing that Chrysler was not brain dead and that we knew how to do beautiful cars. So it was one of those show cars that serves as a shock to the general public system and everybody's awareness. And of course, you can look at the lines and you recognize the later Dodge Intrepid.
So you mentioned everything was very angular, and I remember the tufted leather inside a lot of those cars.
Tufted velour.
Oh, it's horrible. Who set the product direction at that point? I mean, it was very different than Chrysler today.
What the product?
Who set the product direction of Chrysler at that point when you were coming in?
Oh, it was obviously Lee Iacocca. I mean, everything reflected his taste. And when I saw the Imperial for the first time in the studio about 18 months before it came out, I said, boy, that is really, really old looking. And Iacocca said, well, you may think it's old looking, but let me tell you, it's the 60-year-olds who buy this stuff, and by the time you're 60, you're going to love that. And I said, I don't think so, Lee, because I think it's an age wave thing. I think today's 60-year-olds like that because that was what luxury was when they were young. And I said the next generation of 60-year-olds are going to want something that reminds them of a Mercedes-Benz or BMW. It's going to remind them of what prestige was when they were young. And so it is with every generation that mental image of what prestige is changes. Well, Iacocca absolutely didn't get that. He just said, no, this is it. This is luxury. Padded vinyl roof, opera windows, gold filigree lines in the opera windows, phony Baroni wire wheel covers, and so forth.
He and Donald Trump would get along together with
oh
that.
Yeah, it was the Imperial was the ultimate. the way Chrysler's architecture, there was one architecture, it was the K-car architecture. You could shorten it and make a Dodge Shadow and Plymouth Sundance out of it. You could lengthen it to the K-car length, then you could add 2 inches and you had the Plymouth Acclaim and Dodge Spirit, I think.
Spirit, yes.
Then you could lengthen it some more and get the Dodge Dynasty, and then you go another 4 inches and you had the Imperial. By now you've got a lot of distance in what was basically an underbody for a compact. So the first few Imperial prototypes were really nasty cars. And we had to delay it for 6 months and add a whole bunch of additional bracing. And it always was a car that only worked at very low speeds.
But the people working there, did they have the know-how to do better? Like
well,
the engineers?
It was, of course they did, and it was the same as I've encountered in every automobile company. I found that when I got there, my reputation would cause the car guys to come out of the woodwork. And every company's got them, but in a lot of companies they lay low because they're afraid that the financial system is going to brand them as irresponsible if they admit they're car guys. But when I get there, it suddenly becomes legitimate, and they all come out of the woodwork, and then you empower them, and then they invariably do great work.
Let's show an example of that. Cody, let's move up. We're going to do another video here. No, you went over a video. No, back. A little technical difficulty here. Before that, kind of gave it away. There should have been a video there. Nope, that's not a video. After that, there's no video there? No, you're too far back. Anyway, go back to the car. A little technical difficulty here. That car. So basically, if I get my facts correct, you're riding around on a nice spring day in Michigan, and you had a Cobra replica, and you're thinking you need a car that will scare the shit out of people.
Yeah, I had an AC Mark IV, I still have it, AC Mark IV Autocraft Cobra, so it's not exactly a replica, it's a continuation car. I was driving it. I had already removed the Power by Ford emblems. And I thought, it'd be nice if Chrysler could have a car like this. And then it occurred to me that we had a V10 engine coming for the heavy-duty next-generation pickup truck. We had a heavy-duty 5-speed manual coming. We had a front suspension that could probably offer the Dodge Dakota midsize truck where the A-arms would probably work. So I talked to the guys about it, and I said, look, we've got all the expensive parts already. All we have to do is put it together in a car, and the chassis will be custom built anyway. So the first Viper did have the cast iron V10. It did have a 5-speed gearbox out of a Dakota. The only part that survived into production, interestingly enough, was the front suspension off the Dakota.
Which we got here. I mean, this is a departure for you guys at the time. You said you were just telling us about the K-car architecture. This is not a K-car.
No, this was all new. And this one was the first metal car done by the Garfolio family.
Down in Orange County.
Yeah, and this was all metal, and it was a barely running car, and it had nothing to do with anything. I mean, it was just a show car.
Yeah.
It didn't incorporate any of the engineering that later went into the real car. As you can see, it's all metal.
Yeah. You know what I think is very interesting about Detroit? It's like kind of things blend. And do you remember Richard Winkles?
Yeah.
There is a man, really his name is Dick Winkles, I'm not making it up. Let's run this video.
I've got a 1974
kind of a Chevrolet guy.
Well, yeah, and I tell some people.
This guy decided that Chrysler needed a car that would scare.
It's half joking, but almost half serious. That there's a little bit of Pontiac DNA in every Viper because of, what I learned working on GTOs and Trans Ams. I've got a 1974 Super Duty 4-speed Trans Am also that I.
So you're a Pontiac guy.
Oh yeah.
This is the godfather of the engine of the Viper. is a Pontiac and kind of a Chevrolet guy.
Well, yeah, and I tell some.
Had a Chrysler 360 V8 in it, which was boosted to simulate the performance of the V10.
You know what was interesting about that white car? The turnstock is lifted out of a GM car. If you look at it, it's like straight out of a Corvette.
I'm sure
at the time.
that's true, yeah. Well, with the desire to reduce investment, we stole wherever we could. The whole, the differential was Corvette, and we bought it from the same supplier. So we shared wherever we could to keep the investment number low.
You know what they say, a picture's worth a
between father and son, and he's only about 7 or 8 years older than I am, but he was always, first of all, I argued with him publicly a lot, which was probably not smart. I should have probably waited until the meeting was over and then talked to him privately. So I was perhaps more provocative than I needed to be. He was a very proud man, didn't like to be second-guessed, and I second-guessed him a lot. And he was very worried about turning Chrysler over to me. And when somebody on the board asked him, well, why are you so worried about Bob Lutz becoming CEO? He said, because I'm afraid he'd hurt my legacy. So I think that kind of says it all. However, that's when he picked Bob Eaton, who was like the perfect candidate. You know, everybody liked him. GM guy, had just made a lot of money for GM in Europe and so forth. And Bob Eaton was fine, but then when Bob Eaton steered the company into the merger of equals with Daimler, Iacocca got very upset about that and felt that that was a big mistake, and that's when he publicly said picking Bob Eaton was the biggest mistake of his career.
Wow.
He should have picked me. And he said that several times. So
Wow. But you guys merged the two companies.
yeah.
And the products, late 90s Chryslers, I mean, you had the Intrepid, you had the 300, you had some pretty cool cars. The Viper at that point.
Well, but that was before the merger.
Before the merger.
Yeah.
But then you went to Exide, spent some time away.
Well, that's because I was forced to retire. I was 1 year past official retirement age.
Yeah.
And for a while I didn't do anything except do stuff like this. And then a bank called me and said, we have a lot of loans out to an automotive supplier that's looking for a CEO. And I said, yes, I'll take it. Who is it? And that's literally what I did, and because I wanted to run something again. And that was an interesting experience. It was, it was a mission impossible, but it was interesting. And then in 2001,
Rick
Wagner expressed interest in having me at GM.
So you went back to GM. What was it like working for Rick? Because we've kind of charted the course here. You started at GM, and they were the king.
Yeah.
They were the top. Product was great. Then all of 3 car manufacturers had cars like the X cars in the mid-'80s, and now you're in the early 2000s. What's going on?
The company was totally in the thrall of, I won't say the financial system, but it was totally left brain, run by the numbers, and a lot of the bad stuff originated not so much from finance, but from product planning. And the product planners very frequently in all automobile companies, you'd think they were car guys, but they're not. They're usually recycled finance guys, and if they don't see it on a spreadsheet, it doesn't exist. And the whole thing was so systematized, and everything had to happen at a certain time and not before, and they had all these milestones and gates and backup data and pre-meetings for the pre-meetings and so forth, and there was no spontaneity in the whole system, and all the cars were numerically defined, every interior dimension, every characteristic of the car was defined before they gave it to the designers. So the designs didn't originate in design, the cars didn't originate in design anymore. They originated, if you will, in this sort of amorphous committee atmosphere. And they were never benchmarked to be the best. They were always benchmarked to be competitive with what's out there today. Competitive, because the feeling was General Motors is so powerful that if we have a car that's kind of as good as the others, our marketing power will make up for the difference, which was an old-fashioned view. It may have been true in the 50s and 60s, but certainly no longer true in the 90s and in the 21st century. So, and then, of course, with the 3.5-year product development cycle, by the time the cars finally came out, they would fall short of the best of competition. And the way we changed that was just to reverse the process. And there's two ways of looking at the automobile business. The first one is you look at your financial goals and your cost and your investment target, and then you say, well, okay, that's locked in concrete. That's how we're going to do it. That's how much money we're going to make on the car. Now let's do the best car we can for that money. The opposite approach is to ask your people to come up with the greatest car in its category that has ever been developed. Let them do that, and then figure out how to make it affordable. And the one approach is customer and product driven, and then given the test of can we make it work financially. And the other one is we can make it work financially, hopefully we'll have a product that's good enough. And the difference in what comes out the other end between those two approaches is night and day.
Oh, one of the things I always like to point out is you look at a Mercedes from the 60s and 70s, that is engineered to a standard. You look at a Mercedes from about 2000, that is engineered to a price.
Yeah.
And if you look at this CTS
Well,
we have out
today
here,
they're
much better now.
Their product development process and the supplier parts they use, the technology they use, the materials they use, same as any other volume producer.
The new S-Class is an incredible piece of kit. The new Mercedes S-Class is an incredible piece of kit.
Yeah,
It really
okay,
is.
I mean.
But different. But what the real case study is what we were talking about when you came in here. We have the second gen CTS downstairs.
Yeah.
And now this third gen, and this thing is incredible.
Yeah, it is.
Totally different.
Well, that's, as I always say, I think in my judgment, there is no other company in the world that can match General Motors for the depth of its engineering excellence. And that's always been there. The trouble is it's for many decades, it was an unexploited resource.
So you came in and there were some interesting projects you worked on. So what was this?
That was some Saturn, oh, that's a little Saturn convertible, yeah. That was one that was basically finished when I got there.
But then you came in and you worked on this.
Yeah, the car was not a happy car. I think that's
a Solstice.
the Pontiac Solstice. Yeah, and then we did the Sky off the Solstice, and I think that little blue one was called Sky too, as a show car. And I remember we had it in the show for the board of directors, and nobody spent much time with it. And at the end of the show, Rick Wagner said, "Say, Bob, you know, I'm not an expert in style," but he was more than he admitted. But he says, I don't know anything about design, but what's your judgment of that little blue Saturn Roadster over in the corner? I said, well, Rick, now that you've asked, I think it's boring, and I don't think we ought to do it. He says, thank God, that's exactly what I thought. So that one never got anywhere, happily. It was like a pudgy little sausage.
Oh, it was horrible, that car. As a former owner of a Sky Redline, I thank you for making the right car,
well,
not that car.
there's another owner of a Sky Redline in the room here today.
Oh, well, welcome. Did you know that the guy who designed that car, he was in Europe?
It was
Andre Hudson.
I forget his name right now, but he's the same guy that basically did the current Cadillac SRX. Simon Cox.
Okay.
Simon Cox.
Yeah, him and Andre Hudson worked on that car. Very interesting
And
guys.
they did a Vauxhall concept car that was off of the Pontiac Solstice architecture. And it had more change than...
The Opel GT.
Yeah, well, that was basically the Saturn Sky rebadged. But the concept car was very much like that, and then Simon Cox had done that, and we picked up that theme.
So under Iacocca, he's telling you, no, luxury is this, you should be doing these kind of cars. What was Rick doing? What was he like to work for?
Rick was very patient and was really a great protector, because in the beginning, I really shook up the system. I said, from now on, we're going to lead with design. We're going to be focused on design. We're going to spend money on design. We will make other compromises in manufacturing cost or whatever to enable great design. And the system was like, wow, this guy is nuts. This is exactly the opposite of what we've been doing for the last 20 years. And they would send Rick Wagner emails saying, this isn't going to work. This new guy is crazy. He's changing everything. And Rick Wagner would email him back saying he's doing exactly what I want him to do. So I had a lot of top-level support.
What is a quality hider?
Sir?
What is a quality hider?
Oh, a hider.
Yeah.
A hider is when, instead of making interior parts like adjacent sections of an instrument panel, instead of doing them like Audi, where you do them very, very precisely to where you have a 0.5 millimeter crack between adjacent plastic parts on an instrument panel. Instead of doing that, you make everything oval. You round everything off with like TV screen corners. And the idea is, if something has rounded off edges and you've got about a 1/4 of an inch gap, nobody can tell whether it's slightly askew or not. And the same thing was done all over the cars. If you look at old GM cars, the molding, the plastic scalp molding that's right underneath the window, where the window posts are, there used to be almost a 1/2 inch gap hole. And I said, why do we have that much of a gap? And they say, well, you know, sometimes in production, doors would, the posts, when they weld them in, they wouldn't be in exactly the same place. I said, you're kidding. I mean, that's all done by automation now. And if the posts aren't exactly in the same place, the glass isn't going to go up and down. So, you know, don't tell me we need these huge cutouts to account for variation in where the window glass posts are. Yeah, but General Motors requirements are that there be like this 3/8 of an inch of clearance. And I said, let's just take a look at an Audi or a Toyota or an Acura or a BMW, and let's just do it that way. So now you look at a GM car, there's not even a tiny, you can't even get your fingernail in that crack anymore. And it was just a whole bunch of stupid stuff like that.
You had an interesting run-in with a guy by the name of Joe Spielman?
Yeah. Well, we were talking about body fits, and General Motors, you know, the old story, apocryphal, but the word was that Toyota tested body integrity by putting a cat in a car at the end of the assembly line and leave it overnight.
A lot of cats with you.
And then the next morning, this is sort of a cat cruelty story, if the cat was alive and well and very perky, then that meant that some air was getting into the car at some place. And if next morning when they came, the cat was gone. which says all you need to know about body fits in those days.
So you would suffice it to say that General Motors has changed under your stewardship?
Well, mine and everybody else's.
Cats
but
are not really that happy.
I think I was maybe the catalyst for getting the product first and foremost. And if you get the product right, everything else falls into place.
So where does it go from here?
Oh, I think it's all heading in the right direction. Because see, we've got the 3 Detroit companies now interestingly not run by car guys. You've got Alan Mullally, Dan Ackerson, and Sergio Marchionne. And they all three came from somewhere else. And they don't have 30 years of experience of running the car business the old way that was failed, that was broken. The way the American car companies for the last 30 years have approached the car business was just fundamentally wrong. It was all financially driven, it was all Harvard B School stuff, and they really didn't care whether they made refrigerators or washing machines or canned beans, it was just units. And that approach manifestly didn't work. And what you've got with the current crop of CEOs is guys who only know one thing. They've only figured out one thing. Great cars make money, poor cars don't. And they said, why was GM in trouble and Ford and Chrysler? Why were they all in trouble 20 years ago? Second-rate cars. Okay, now let's look at the last 5 years. Why is everybody doing so well? Great products. Ergo, let's keep doing great products and everything will be all right. And of course, that doesn't mean the financial discipline is thrown out. You need bean counters. I mean, you definitely need, just like a race car needs engine and brakes. And the finance guys make a tremendous contribution, and the product development guys should always be under pressure.
But will that stay? Will that ethos still stay with? Because GM, you've been gone now, what, 3 years?
Yeah.
And that Cadillac out there, you had a little bit to do with, but not a lot.
That's what encourages me. Look at the new pickup trucks, which everybody says are okay, best in the market now. Look at the C7 Corvette, which was done
out there
entirely since I left. The reception to the new Impala, and that one was half done when I left, and I was worried that, like after I left Chrysler, I was hardly out the door when everybody said, "Thank God he's gone. Now we can go back to doing business the old way." And the Germans helped a lot in that, by the way. And I was afraid somewhat that the same thing would happen at GM. It just didn't. In fact, if anything, the focus on absolute total product excellence is super strong at GM now, and it is at Ford. I mean, look at this sensational success of the Ford Fusion, which is a beautiful design and a really good car, and is on its way to beating the Toyota Camry and the Honda Accord as #1 selling midsize car in America.
That's an example of design. I mean, you look at that car, you wouldn't think it's a Ford.
Of course, it does look like an Aston Martin sedan.
Absolutely. Audi on the side, Aston on the front.
As Bill Mitchell once said when he was criticized that the Chevy Monza coupe looked like a Ferrari ripoff, he said, "My motto is, if you're going to steal, rob a bank and not a grocery store." So in this case, Ford robbed a bank, aesthetically.
Okay. So we actually have a C7 Corvette out there, which is a stunning car, by the way. I'm lucky enough to drive that. There's an interesting story with Taj coming to you about the concept of changing the architecture of that car.
Oh, which one?
The chief engineer of Corvette, Taj Yukter.
Oh, yeah. Okay, that story, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Taj Yukter, before the '08 meltdown, spent a lot of time talking to me.
This guy is focused. This guy is a major engineer.
Oh, yeah. Taj Yukter is probably one of the best high-performance car engineers in the world today.
Absolutely.
And gains the respect of the Germans, because I knew the chief engineer of AMG, and when the Corvette CR1 came out, AMG immediately bought one because they could not make themselves believe that an American car company could do a car of that performance with a pushrod engine and sell it for $100,000. And I think the world of high-performance automobiles is now even more flabbergasted with the new C7. And this is all Taj Yukter's stuff. Well, Taj was convinced that we were at the absolute limit of added performance with the C6 chassis and with rear-wheel drive. And even with moving the engine back and down, he pointed out that we couldn't get close enough to 50-50 weight distribution to really, we could go more power, but we'd never get it down. And we could have more and more horsepower, but the car wouldn't go any faster. So he argued that the only way that was going to work was to go mid-engine. And
I like this guy.
yeah, and you know, the cost wouldn't have changed. I mean, the componentry would have all been the same. So we could have really done a high-performance mid-engine sports car beginning in the mid to high 50,000s, which would have been pretty much a sensation. And who knows, it may still come at some point. But then in '08, General Motors ran out of money, obviously, and what had been like a $900 million program to change the architecture to a mid-engine became a couple of $100 million and do the best you can. And this is why I say this is when bean counters are sometimes very useful, because without financial constraints, engineers sometimes reach for a very expensive solution. But when the finance system says, I know you'd like to do that, but we don't have the money, and the only amount of money we have is X, do the best you can, you have to go through a 3-week sulk period where and then they realize they're not going to get more money, and then they turn to, and 9 times out of 10, they attain the original objective without having spent all the money. And that's exactly what happened with the C7. And one thing Taj did get that he said was absolutely essential was 2 inches more wheelbase. And you never like to put wheelbase into a sports car because it somewhat reduces agility and it increases the turning circle. But in this case, that trade-off was well worth it because it permitted moving the engine back some more and getting the weight distribution 50-50. So now it's exactly like, it's got all the benefits of the mid-engine car, but with the undeniable appeal of a front-engine vehicle.
The engine's so far back in that car, too.
Yeah, it's a mid-engine car, but it's front mid-engine rather than rear.
So that's what did I see about 2 weeks ago?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I had a C7, came to your house.
Yep.
You were about to go fly the L39.
Yep.
You pulled out your ZR1. I said, let's go drag race.
Yep.
What did you say?
I said, I have to go flying now. And
No.
I said, I'd suck the doors off you on a straight. Because, hey, you cannot, no matter how good a C7 is, but you're not going to offset 200 more horsepower.
Hey, the same way I tried, you could give me the shot.
And lighter weight. Because the ZR1 is really light. And it's, but then it'll be interesting when they do the first comparison tests of a 2013 ZR1 versus a 2014 C7 with the Z51 package. And I would bet you that on most race courses, the C7 with less horsepower is going to be faster than the 2013 ZR1.
I wouldn't argue with on that. Having spent some time in that car, I wouldn't argue with it at all.
Yeah.
Definitely lighter, more usable power. So
Yeah.
you should have given me the shot. Okay, guys, we are going to switch a little bit and have you guys ask some questions. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to ask whoever is going to ask. I've got a couple of questions here written down. You guys gave me a bunch. So I'm going to ask you to come up and pick up this microphone. Cody's going to help you with the microphone here. Oh, you know what? Before we switch to questions, we have to welcome a very special guest. Talk about Pontiacs. Matter of fact, before he sits down, I think he should come over here. Jim, I want
there we go.
to introduce everybody to the godfather of the GTO.
Hey, Jim. Hey, nice to see you again.
Come on, stand up here, Jim. So,
What a great gathering.
well, thank you very much for coming here.
Well,
So-
how could I not come?
Absolutely. Now, tell me what you told me before.
Well, when I first joined GM in 1963, and I was there in the U.S. 63, 4, 5, and then at
Over here,
Opel,
the light.
there was
Over here, right here.
there was a limited number of car guys in GM. I mean, it was a very, very small group. But the name that kept coming up the car guy's great hope in General Motors. It was always Jim Wangers, Jim Wangers, Jim Wangers. So
Car guys,
in
great
my
hope.
early days at GM, Jim Wangers was my hero, role model, and idol.
Isn't that nice? Oh,
It's the truth.
Well, you were the real McCoy.
So we have
And,
to
and
thank
the,
you as
and
well.
the,
well, I want to thank you and you.
So that car you guys saw out there, we've got some cars from the studio audience that hasn't seen, excuse me, the studio audience has seen this, but the stream audience hasn't. We've got a bunch of cars on display, and there's one very special car out there, one of the last Pontiacs. Who owns that car?
I guess.
The Solstice, the GXP Coupe.
Of course.
Yes, thanks to Jim Wangers here. He's going to be here tomorrow doing
Well,
his own
and-
cruising.
I can't forget my nephew, Gordon.
Yes.
who Also,
There's Gordon. Thank you, Gordon, very much for loaning us that car. You're not getting it back.
It's a good place for it, I can stay there.
Thank you for joining us.
well, thank you.
Okay.
One more time.
hey, Jim,
Great to see you.
great to see you
Two
again.
legends together. I mean, look at this.
Thanks for coming.
He does his own drag racing, actually. Yeah. He did so much drag racing, he had to sell his car to a policeman. I'm not joking, that was the truth. Okay, so who is Edward I here? Am I mispronouncing that? Edward A? Or Edward, could you come on up to the mic? Cody, the lovely and gracious Cody, will share the mic with you. And you have a question for Bob. Tell us your name and where you're from, Ed.
I'm from Claremont, California, and I'm recently retired from General
Can
Mills.
you actually stand, you're right in front of the camera, so
Sorry,
everybody
please.
sees your back.
I'm from Claremont, California, and I'm a shareholder of General Motors. Just retired from General Mills.
Okay.
I go through the internet, and I see the product availability in Europe. And one question is, I never see Silverados or Sierra pickup trucks. Are these available in Europe? And I always think about the profitability. These are profitable vehicles. And I think, gee whiz, could they add these to the product line to add a Opel or Vauxhall? So that's my question to you. And I see sometimes I go into the GM website and I see the Silverados available in South America or Central America, in Argentina, Chile, and of course in Mexico. But my question to you, sir, is the Silverados, the Sierras, could this be a viable product to be assembled or exported to Europe?
What,
That's my
exports of US GM cars to Europe or the other way around?
Well, export the Sierras from Mexico into Europe or assemble them in Europe. Is there a market for a Chevrolet pickup truck in Europe?
Oh, okay. The market for pickups in Europe is almost non-existent because it's somewhat used for hauling, and when people use it seriously commercially, they almost always have a box over it with a lockable door in the back, and that's why Europeans, for commercial use, they always use vans. So pickup trucks are very rare, and almost every American CEO of Ford or General Motors says, we're going to introduce pickup trucks over here. So every time you got a new CEO, you had to listen to the story of how pickup trucks were really going to get big and how big they were in the States. And all we have to do is explain it to the Europeans and they'll start buying them. There is practically no market for pickup trucks in Europe. Now I'll tell you where you will see pickup trucks. It's the extremely wealthy athletes or show business personalities will buy a loaded Ford Raptor with the maximum wheels, all black, et cetera, the equivalent of a $350,000 Lamborghini Murcielago or Aventador over here, and they'll drive it up to St. Moritz and park it in front of the Palace Hotel. So it becomes the exotic statement of, I have it and you don't. And they're kind of, American pickup trucks are a piece of prestige transportation for the extremely wealthy in Europe.
So basically, the footballers buy those things.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah,
The
okay.
Same, that's how Escalades are sold in Europe too,
Yeah, I lived in,
as in the U.S.
yeah, it's true. I lived in England for 3 years, and every footballer had an Escalade. Not a Bentley anymore. It
Yeah,
was
I
an
know,
Escalade.
yeah.
Absolutely. Is Paul Davis here? Paul Davis. He left. Okay. So Paul Davis has a question for you. What percentage of CTSV wagons were built with a stick shift? Do you know this?
With a stick?
With a stick shift. A
You
station
know what?
wagon
I
with a
don't
stick
know, but it's got to be infinitesimally small. It's like the similar question of Pontiac Solstice GXP coupes. Out of 1,000 Pontiac Solstice coupes, maybe 200 of them were GXPs. Out of the 200 GXPs, 4 had manual transmissions.
shift. So we have 25% of the market here in the museum.
And I've got 25% of it in Michigan. But there were almost no manuals, and I would suspect the same thing is true for the Cadillac CTSV wagon. I would say manual transmission. First of all, the overall volume of wagons is low, and the percentage of manuals is probably lower yet. It's probably in the hundreds.
Do you see the wagon continuing in the CTS
No.
family? You know?
You know what? We did that. We did the wagon for one specific reason. It was going to be the spearhead of Cadillac's push into Europe. Because if you look at BMW 5s, Audi A6s, Mercedes E-Class, the wagons radically outsell the four-door sedans in Europe. I mean, if you drive around Europe, all you see is wagons, 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 and
Oh,
you
absolutely.
rarely see a four-door sedan anymore. So if you only have a four-door notchback sedan and you're going into the European market, you're only playing in about 20% of that market. So you must have a wagon. So we developed the wagon, and it was going to finally enable us to get into more of the mainstream mid-size luxury sedan market in Europe. And then, unfortunately, you know, the recession hit, and all of the European plants had to be canceled. So the wagon became a U.S. program, and I think it's a lovely car. It's very interesting. I had one for about 18 months. I just love the thing, but Americans just are not that attuned to station wagons anymore. They'll buy a station wagon if it's a little bit higher off the ground. The minute it becomes a crossover, they
like
buy
an
it.
Audi cross all road, something like that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but if it's low and based on a passenger car, the American public won't buy it. And it's really silly because they have all the advantages of a passenger car. They're available in all-wheel drive. They have the convenience of a hatch and so forth and so on, and yet it's just not a popular body
Well,
style
in this
anymore.
case, I could imagine this is not just a realistic tone, but it's fast and it has a stick.
Yeah.
I'm sure his wife loves this car.
Yeah.
Is John Cramen here? John Cramen? John, can you join us with the lovely Cody here and ask a question? Tell us where you're from.
Hi, Bob. John Cramen, Mecum Auctions
Hello.
from the Chicago area. Question I have, certainly aware of the Chinese connection, but would like to know your personal thoughts on the demise of Pontiac, and specifically compared to Buick still being around. I understand the Chinese connection with Buick, but I'd like to kind of hear your thoughts on that, please.
Okay. Well, I've been asked that question numerous times, and the feds basically wanted to get GM down to Cadillac and Chevrolet. They said, you don't need all these brands. You need one prestige brand and one mass market brand. And we said, well, we can't get rid of Buick because Buick is important in China. And if a Buick becomes an orphan in the United States, the Chinese are no longer going to be interested in it. And the Fed said, well, okay, fair enough, but everything else goes. And we said, well, we'd also like to keep GMC. They said, well, GMC is basically just like Chevrolet. And we said, that may be true. There may be a lot of shared components, but GMC has an entirely different image, a different customer base. People are willing to pay premium prices for a GMC, and here's the profitability. And the Fed said, whoops, okay, keep GMC. So Now we had Buick, GMC, Cadillac, and Chevrolet. And then I badly wanted to keep Pontiac because Pontiac was on its way back. It had been mismanaged for a number of years. You know, it was we build excitement, and the excitement was only in the plastic body cladding. Mechanically, there was nothing about a Pontiac in the 90s that would make your heart beat faster.
We build excitement.
Yeah. So, and with the Solstice and Solstice Coupe, and with the Pontiac G8, which was a great car, we were embarked on a strategy of making Pontiac different from the rest of GM in that Pontiac would not get any front-wheel drive cars. It would all be rear-wheel drive. And the next one, the next G6 was going to use the architecture of the Cadillac ATS. So it was going to be a 3 Series sized,
Wow.
3 Series sized rear-wheel drive Pontiac with basically the Cadillac ATS, depremiumized obviously, and a lot of the cost taken out, but still fundamentally that architecture, that was going to be the next G6. And I think we could have moved Pontiac away from every other American volume brand and really started positioning it as a very attractive US alternative to some of the, and obviously at much lower prices than the European rear-wheel drive cars. But the Fed said, yeah, how much money you made in Pontiac in the last 10 years? Well, the answer was nothing. So they said, it goes. And, you know, when the guy who's handing you a check for $53 billion says, I don't want Pontiac, or drop Pontiac or you don't get the money, it doesn't take you very long to make up your mind. But I think it is a shame. Pontiac was on its way back, and it was killed before the plant could really sprout and blossom, you know, but it was well on its way. So I agree with you. I thought Pontiac was had a wonderful history, mismanaged for a number of years in the 80s and 90s, and was clearly on its way back. And we were starting to see a very good customer base in Solstices, and especially in the G8, which was favorably compared in a lot of road tests to BMW 5s. You know,
Awesome
people would
car.
say, I mean, dynamically the car is as good, and it's more powerful, and it's way cheaper. So it was too bad, but you can't go through Chapter 11 without some really harmful effects.
Brings up a point though. How do you see a lot of cars where the pricing is similar? Like, I just drove a Buick Regal GS. Great car. You know,
Yeah.
it's the Opel Insignia with the all-wheel drive now and the turbo engine, but it's 40 grand. An ATS is 40 grand.
Yeah, but in the Regal Turbo, you're going to get a much higher level of equipment for your 40 than the base
ATS.
price ATS. By the time you get the 2-liter turbo engine and a lot of the other features, but there's always been that overlap. And let me remind you that you can also easily wind up paying $85,000 for a Chevy pickup.
Wow.
Well, you get the dually, heavy-duty dually, all-wheel drive, diesel, maximum towing package, maximum interior, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You're not going to be far from 80.
So that's really the footballer's cowboy Cadillac.
Or wealthy rancher out west, you know, or wealthy construction executive who wants to drive a pickup just like his guys.
On that note, let's talk fuel efficiency. Javier Ryan Johnson. See the lovely Cody here. And where are you from, Javier?
San Francisco, California.
San Francisco. You came in far.
Yeah.
Like this guy.
Based on the trends that we're seeing with increases in horsepower and fuel efficiency, do you see a time where we're going to be able to maximize the amount of power output from an engine and also maximize, say, the miles per gallon? Is that a solvable problem where you don't have to pick between the performance model or the economy model?
I don't think, even today, I don't think we have to choose anymore. You can get both, and with federal requirements on fuel economy, we're definitely going to see cars that deliver both very high levels of fuel economy combined with high levels of power. It's just that the combination comes at a price premium. I would say, you know, the ultimate high performance sedan today is probably an all-electric Tesla, which even though the EPA penalizes all electric cars for electricity generation, and I think the Tesla, even though its real miles per gallon is infinite, but I think the rating is something like 93 miles per gallon because they calculate the carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere through electricity production. But okay, so you've got this either infinite miles per gallon or 93 miles per gallon Tesla, 0 to 60 in 4-point-something seconds, a top speed way in excess of 100 miles an hour. So you're clearly getting both, but you're getting it for $100,000. And what's the new Porsche supercar that sells in the millions?
Yeah, the 918 Spider.
Yeah, which
Yeah.
is, I think,
$1 million.
probably equivalent fuel economy of way in excess
Yeah.
of 100 miles per gallon, and it's probably one of the fastest cars in the world today. They're not going to sell very many because what's the
The
base
car
price?
is so expensive, one of its options is another car.
Yeah, that's true, yeah.
Yeah.
And then but do you remember the base price of 3.2 million or something?
Oh, for the 918? No,
Yeah.
it's only 800,000. It's a bargain. You can afford one,
Oh,
Bob.
really? Well, that sounds,
Yeah.
now we're
I
getting
know a
down
guy
into
at Porsche.
reasonable territory.
Yeah. And then the checkbox option's like another 80 grand for a 911 to go with it that
Yeah.
matches your car. It's ridiculous, and everyone gets it. I mean, if you had 800 grand, you would too. Speaking of mileage requirements, is Tom here? Tom Starr? Tom Starr? No Tom Starr. This is an interesting question because you are definitely a kind of like a frustrated designer. Is it true that I'm having a very hard time reading? This guy must be a doctor. Is it true that designers are happy about CAFE mileage requirements because it unshackles them from restraints of the bean counters? Obviously, he read your book.
And I think they're both happy and unhappy because I think a lot of times they would like to do a design which may or may not be the ultimate in aerodynamics. And but the people in charge of the vehicle program are going to tell them, no, you've got to make the deck lid higher, you've got to make the corner sharper here, et cetera, because we need to get a drag coefficient of 0.28 or 0.29. So I would say in some ways they're happy because it permits them to do very slippery shapes. In other ways, they're probably unhappy because they're driven into, for instance, to get a drag coefficient of 0.27 on the Chevy Volt without making it look exactly like a Toyota Prius was a very hard thing to do. And if you look at the Honda hybrid, that looks exactly like a Toyota Prius.
Horrible car.
Because they really, there are only so and so many ways that you can get that low drag shape. So I'd say it's a mixed bag. There's good parts about CAFE requirements for designers and bad parts. I think the engineers kind of like it because it enables a lot of engineering, it enables the creation of a lot of engineering solutions where in the old days, the bean counters would have said, no, we're not going to pay for that. Stay with the old engine, that's good enough, or stay with a 6-speed gearbox, we don't need 9 speeds. And nowadays, if the engineers explain that this technology is necessary to meet the future fuel economy requirements, it does enable a lot of new technology, but it comes at a price.
This is a car museum, so I think we should end on a very specific note. Are you still involved with electrification of fleet vehicles and
Yeah.
pickup trucks? And you are literally taking, so if I understand this correctly, you're taking gas V8 engines out of pickup trucks and putting
Yes.
electric systems.
Yeah, that's via
But then you're
Motors.
taking electric power systems out of Fiskars and putting gas V8s in them.
Putting Corvette LS9 drivetrains in.
Exactly.
Yes, thus creating the world's fastest four-door sedan. Yeah, well, both ways work, you know.
And this is why he is the real James Bond. He is the only person that can do this. Thank you for joining us. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. Okay.
Thank you guys for coming and joining us. Bob, we're going to have a little bit of a break for Bob, and then we're going to do a book signing downstairs. For all of you in the room, as well as for all of you that are watching us, thank you for coming. And then next month, our guest is Parnelli Jones, IndyCar winner and IndyCar team owner, November 16th, 11 a.m. Thank you for joining us.
Okay.
Okay. You want to hop back on stage?